I do think that given that we've seen multiple shocks hitting companies, that there is a need to diversify the sources of your inputs. Secondly, I think it's important for companies also to alter the technology they use, how they produce, so that they have inputs that are much more substitutable.
So international financial institutions like the IMF are working hard to help policymakers deal with all the disruption in the world these days. But what about the private sector? What is their role in all of this?
How should each of us think about what we can do given the funding gap in emerging markets?
There is the way that public action can catalyze private investments.
Today, we hear the Chief Financial Officer of Google and Alphabet, Ruth Porat, ask IMF First Deputy Managing Director Gita Gopinath how the private sector fits into the growing number of challenges and opportunities in the global economy. Here's Ruth Porat.
I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with Gita Gopinath, the First Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund and previously Chief Economist of the IMF. Prior to joining the IMF, Gita had a 2-decade-long career as an academic, including at the economics departments at the University of Chicago and at Harvard, where she held a chair. She has led 13 releases of the IMF's World Economic Outlook. So we're very fortunate to have an extremely insightful voice on the challenges that we are seeing ahead. Thank you so much, Gita, for being here with us.
Thank you, Ruth. A real pleasure to join you.
I'm going to start with our time together in Davos. You commented there that the sentiment of CEOs in Davos was inconsistent with the data that you are seeing, and that really got my attention. Can you take us through what was the disconnect you saw, and what's your view of the economic outlook as we sit here today?
So, Ruth, firstly, in terms of the outlook, without a doubt, global growth is slowing. And we downgraded our forecast for the global economy in April from 4.4% to 3.6%. The war has hit many economies sizably as prices have gone up for energy and food around the world, further fueling inflation. That has been a knock on growth. Central banks around the world, especially now in the major economies, are raising rates with a specific purpose of slowing down what they see as overheating in their economies. And we have China, which has had much more stringent lockdowns than many anticipated. And the recent numbers that have come out of China certainly point towards even weaker growth than we expected in April. So without a doubt, there are headwinds to growth, and growth is slowing. The disconnect, if I may use that word, that I thought found in Davos was the jumping to the conclusion that we are staring right now at a global recession, and it seems imminent. And that's the part where I would take a little pause there, because for this year, with the global economy right now, we have 3.6%. We could head for a downgrade. That is a possibility, but still, that is a pretty healthy growth number relative to what we know in terms of decadal averages. Now, there is a question of what comes next year, which is 2023, when all of this tightening in monetary policy and so on starts having an effect. The fiscal stimulus that was a big part of the revival gets withdrawn even more. And I think 2023 is a year when I would say that, growth continues to slow. And then the risks, I would say then, if there were worse news on other fronts in terms of sanctions and counter sanctions, or in China, or in inflation, you could risk ending up with a recessionary environment. But as of now, I would not make that prognosis.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I want to shift gears to about a year or so ago. The head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, declared a new Bretton Woods moment. And since then, we've seen a number of ambitious initiatives coming out of the IMF on debt, on development, on climate. The $650 billion SDR allocation was a very high-profile breakthrough. Can you help us understand what is meant by this, quote, unquote Bretton Woods moment. What are the guiding principles? What should we know about it? What does it mean for each of us?
So in 1944, as you know, it was in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire that the IMF was born, where the Articles Agreement was signed. And the goal was to help the world prosper with peace. And right now we are, I would think of at this current juncture, we are at a time where we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, clearly not in the direction of peace. And that is now generating further tensions that were building up even before the pandemic and the war. So we were concerned about geopolitical tensions when it comes to trade. It was there in 2019 and 2018 with the US-China tariff wars. You have the decoupling that we were concerned about in terms of technology. So this particular, now the current environment we're in is one where we do worry about further fragmentation in the global economy. So if you ask me right now, if I look at globalization, would I say that we are now in the phase of deglobalization? And actually, I would say no, that's not the case. I genuinely believe that, yes, global trade as a share of GDP has slowed. That was to be expected. We have had headwinds to globalization, but at the same time, global trade was very resilient during the pandemic years. I am more concerned about what may be coming, the risks that are out there, especially in the current geopolitical environment, the tremendous uncertainty around policies with discussions of nearshoring and regionalization and so on, and what that could actually translate to. And that is costly because when we did the study in 2019 about what was the cost of the global economy of the increase in trade uncertainty that came with the US-China trade agreements, that shaved off about 1% from global GDP. And now we're talking about a potentially much greater scale of trade uncertainty. So that's kind of the juncture we're in. So in terms of the principles of the new Bretton Woods moment, I would say first and foremost is it's important for the global community and for global leaders to do no harm, given that we're in an environment where global growth is slowing, where inflation is very high. So the policy mistakes can be very costly. We know that global integration has been very helpful, keeping productivity high and therefore keeping price pressures lower. We cannot mess that up. The second principle I would say is that in addition to just prosperity, I think there's a clear recognition that we need greater sustainability and we need greater resilience. If you look at also measures of income inequality, wealth inequality over the last couple of decades, they have gotten worse. There have been attempts to address it, but much more action is needed on that front. Similarly, we need to agree that we have to grow. It has to be done in a sustainable fashion. We need to address the catastrophic risks of climate change. We need greater resilience. Without a doubt, the war and the pandemic has shown that it's important to be able to secure your supply chains, to diversify. So all of this needs to be done. So this is the new Bretton Woods moment in the sense of prosperity, but that comes with shared prosperity, resilience, and sustainability. And that's what we are working towards with our other institutions.
Excellent. Now, I want to try and double click into some of the issues that you raised. So let's start with the connection between the war in Ukraine, food shortages, and the humanitarian implications. How are you at the IMF thinking about this? And what, if anything, would you like to see the private sector doing more of to help?
I think this is a major concern for us, the food security issue. And frankly, I think this is one area where there's probably more bad news that may be coming in the future than what we've already seen, because a lot depends upon the harvest right now, the ability to get wheat out of Ukraine. The shortages of fertilizers are creating problems everywhere in the world. So we're very concerned about this. And we know that there are regions of the world where food, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, food makes up about 40% of their consumption basket. So it is a tremendous hit to livelihoods around the world. And we saw this happen in 2007 and 8 that was the previous time there was a global food crisis. And there are lessons to be learned from it, which is kind of what we are trying to transmit to the world and saying that, we don't want to worsen the problem from what it already exists. So what does that mean? That means that first, telling countries as best possible not to put export controls. Now, unfortunately, we are seeing many countries do that. Since the start of the war, about 20 countries have restricted their exports of food and fertilizers. And that is going to only worsen the problem. And frankly, it just brings back retaliation. It's terrible for world prices and food. Now, at the IMF, because one of our main jobs is surveillance, which is we track what different countries do, we talk to our member countries. We try to recommend other strategies through which they can address the concerns they have about food security in their own country without putting these kinds of export bans. The second is, how do you actually address this problem when you have food prices going up? And how do you create social safety nets? So that's another area which the IMF specializes in, which is helping countries build stronger social safety nets, be able to provide the kind of cash transfers that are needed for the most vulnerable, and of course, with help with our own financing to help countries be able to do that. And of course, in all of these regards, we're working very closely with the WHO, so with the WTO, with the World Bank, with World Food Organizations to make all of this happen. In terms of what the private sector can do, of course, first and most, it would be great to be able to increase the supply of food and food inputs, which means like fertilizers around the world. So any action on that front would be tremendously helpful. Making sure that there's financing available to farmers for seeds, for fertilizers, working capital needs, that would be very helpful. On a slightly more longer term basis, I think we need more innovation to come up with solutions for climate resistant crops, because the problems that we're seeing now are not just about the war in Ukraine, but also because of drought in many parts of the world. So there can be technological innovation on that front in terms of the kinds of seeds and fertilizers that are used, making agricultural production more productive, more efficient. How can small landowners increase the amount of their output? All of those kinds of solutions would be very helpful.
Well, that takes me right to the next question, which is really about climate action. You commented on the link between it's not just the war, but also climate change that's driving this food shortage, food security issue. And you helped set up a climate change team inside the IMF to analyze, among other things, optimal climate mitigation policies. IMF has clearly been a leading voice in the green transition. And if you could just, again, double click, how should each of us think about what we can do to create an equitable transition given the funding gap in emerging markets?
Yeah, this is the major challenge of our time. We estimated that it would take the world about $3.3 trillion a year in energy investments over this decade, so until 2030, to be able to get to the net zero carbon emissions goal of 2050. In addition, we need sizable investments for climate adaptation. These are very large numbers, though we know that the benefits are many multiples of these trillion numbers. But in terms of just financing, like you said, this proposes a challenge for many countries. So the question of what needs to be done, and here it cannot happen through public money alone. The scales just don't exist. It has to come from a large amount of private investment going along with this. But there is the way that public action can catalyze private investment. So here is where I would say, firstly, policies matter a huge deal, which is that when governments signal their very strong commitment to climate mitigation goals and follow through with real action, which is in terms of carbon pricing, making it very clear and providing a very strong signal to the private sector to move away from energy-intensive, carbon-heavy activities away towards more greener alternatives. That is one way to provide, to bring in more private sector investment. Then in terms of just the pure financing needs, again, we'll have to get public money, but it has to be leveraged up in multiple ways to get to the scale that's needed. So there is concessional financing that is being provided. We'll have to provide it more smartly, more quicker. We should be able to find ways of analyzing projects much more quickly. We have, governments making very concrete actions of saying that if you do certain climate actions, we'll give you money. As an example, the UK just agreed with the Democratic Republic of Congo to give them $500 million if they will prevent forest loss, prevent deforestation. So there are other actions of this kind that's happening. There's also exploration of first loss guarantees that the public sector, that certain banks could probably provide, multinational banks could provide. We need to explore this fully, but that's one way of reducing the cost of borrowing to governments and being able to then get to this kind of scale of investments that's needed. We also work with governments so that they improve their own governance frameworks, which make them more easily able to tap markets. And the other piece where you could have this engagement is when it comes to just data, and there's a big gap in the climate space in this regard. We don't have globally harmonized systems of defining, how carbon emissions. There's also what countries are actually undertaking in terms of reducing it. We need to close that gap. We need to have much more standardized disclosure standards around the world. Kind of all of that are public initiatives that I think will catalyze more private sector investment. So there's a push being made on all these fronts, and I'm optimistic that we will move ahead. But there's a real great urgency to getting all of this done very quickly.
Yeah, we very much agree there's an urgency. We've been focused on our impact on the planet since really the founding of Google and have been carbon neutral since 2007. And I think very much to your point about urgency, there are solutions that we are implementing here today. We are also looking at longer term innovation, but through a lot of data analytics and AI and the tools that are here available, we are already working with companies that want to understand carbon emissions through their entire supply chain. And I think that's an important point. It's not just about what comes later, but we can each be doing things now. So appreciate your comments there. If I could switch to some of the post-COVID imbalances you referenced at the outset. So some countries are obviously lifting restrictions while other countries are maintaining tight quarantines. And so there are obviously bottlenecks still in global supply chains for various goods. That then feeds into inflation, which triggers some of the humanitarian issues that we talked about, the political issues. So again, what would you like to see the private sector doing more of in this regard?
I mean, without a doubt, supply chain bottlenecks, disruptions that all started out, and we saw that most starkly in the early 2021, has lasted much longer than any of us expected. Now, of course, part of that reason was that there's been one shock following another shock. The war in Ukraine is a contributing factor. But in addition, the Omicron outbreak in China, the lockdowns that has necessitated, that's another reason why. If you look at, for instance, supply delivery times or container shipping costs, or even the chips production, all of which we thought we would be in a much better shape by the end of last year, but we're now in the middle of 2022 and still all of those problems remain pretty elevated, I think is a major concern. So in terms of just looking ahead as to what we might expect is the fact that there's a part of the supply chain disruption story which has just come from a pandemic with a huge increase in demand for goods and away from services. When people went back home, they started buying a lot of things that they would otherwise go and access as a service outside, buying computers and work from home equipment and so on. And that was of a scale that has never been seen before. So even without a pandemic, if we had this massive shift in demand, we would have seen supply breakdowns. So, over time, we are seeing the correction back, which is that now consumer spending is more moving towards services away from goods, much slower than we thought it would happen, but it is happening. So that some of that would autocorrect, and we should hopefully see some of that unwinding itself. But there are other kinds of disruptions that are not going to go away. For instance, energy trade is never going to look the same, for sure. We know that. We've seen the direction of what's happening in terms of Europe and where they're going to get their energy from. And I think other countries around the world are going to also be shifting faster to renewables, also to become self-reliant. So there are those changes that are happening. In terms of what needs to be done, I think One is on the public space. I would say that there are countries where the port infrastructure is just not where it should be. That is also true in the US. And that's why, there have been announcements about investing in improving the infrastructure. So improve investments in infrastructure logistics is going to be one important part of the story. I do think that given that we've seen, again, multiple shocks hitting companies, that there is a need to diversify the sources of your inputs. So relying exclusively on one country can be costly, as we've seen in recent months and years. We need to have much more diversification. Secondly, I think it's important for companies also to alter the technology that they use, how they produce, so that they have inputs that are much more substitutable. So let me give you a couple of examples. Tesla, for instance, rewrote its computer software so it could use certain kinds of chips that were more readily available. That's one way of substituting. General Motors announced that they were going to reduce the number of unique chips that they use by 95%, so that it's much more substitutable what they have access to. So I think companies around the world are going to have to do this. And again, one of the big blessings of the pandemic has been innovation and the ability to, with vaccines, to be able to respond to the pandemic, to be able to work from home. And that should continue, of course, to help solve these kinds of problems.
Thank you so much. Sadly, we are out of time and coming to a close. I think we could go on for quite some time. I'm going to ask for a one-word answer so we end on an optimistic note. You've given us some reason for optimism, but what gives you optimism as we close out this conversation this morning? One-word answer.
Well, if it has to be one word, it has to be the people I work with. It's been a tremendously challenging time these last 2.5 years. But my colleagues are truly inspirational. And I think that with that strength and passion and engagement and the institution that we are, where we bring together 190 member countries, that some of the big concerns I raised at the beginning about fragmentation and so on is something that we can help address.
Thank you. That is a fantastic way to end. Thank you for all that you and the team there are doing. Thank you so much, Gita, for being with us.
Thank you, Ruth.
That was Chief Financial Officer of Alphabet and Google, Ruth Porat, speaking with IMF First Deputy Managing Director and former Chief Economist, Gita Gopinath. Look for more IMF podcasts wherever you listen, including on Google Podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter @IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.